Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, one of the debates that always rages, or regularly rages, in fact, when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine is that of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel as being equated to that of anti-Semitism overall. And now with definitions of anti-Semitism that have come out, such as the IHRA definition, which, and of course I'm paraphrasing, to an extent equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. This debate has raged even during this latest bout of violence that we've seen across the occupied territories. So it's an important discussion to have, and we're going to put, of course, those issues to our panelists in just a few moments. But beyond that, too, then there's the issue of now that we have a ceasefire, quote unquote, in place, what does this mean? Have things changed? Has there been a shift? We've discussed this for a few shows now. Has there been a shift in global opinions about what's been happening in the occupied territories? One of the key elements to see has always been the American Jewish population and their points of view about what's happening in the occupied territories as well. And there seems to have been a shift in that regard as well, which is also important to observe from afar. And will that then change or add enough pressure on the U.S. government or other governments in how they then deal with the Israelis? And that, again, is something I'm going to put in a few moments to our guests who are joining us. Well, joining us from Heidelberg is Dr. Shir, who is a scholar and journalist. His recent book is titled The Privatization of Israeli Security. Joining us from Jerusalem is Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And also joining us from Jerusalem is Miko, who is an Israeli-American activist and author. His books were called General Sun, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, as well as Injustice, the Story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. Miko, Jeff, and Shir, thank you to all three of you for taking our time out this Saturday to join us. Miko, I'd like to start with you. I know it's a very heavy question, but is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? Heavy, I mean, because it's debated so much.
It's not heavy, and it's not, and criticizing Israel couldn't be farther from being anti-Semitic. It couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, you know, the Zionists very early on realized when they saw that the majority of the Jewish people around the world opposed them, that they had to come up with a strategy. And it's a strategy that started in the early 20th century and goes on till today, which is to accuse anybody who opposes Zionism, even Jews, as either anti-Semites or self-hating or all kinds of things like that. But, you know, Zionism should be in the same column as anti-Semitism. It's a form of racism. It is an established a racist apartheid regime in Palestine. And so Zionism, anti-Semitism, all forms of supremacy and racism are all in the same column. Those who fight racism should be fighting Zionism, should be fighting anti-Semitism. That's all in the other column. But there's absolutely no question that conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is part of a Zionist strategy to delegitimize anyone who criticizes them and to shield them. And you mentioned the IHRA definition. It's basically a shield to protect themselves from criticism and to gag anybody else who wants to criticize, or as in my case, for example, reject Zionism altogether, because if you do that, then it's somehow racism. But I think it's a very, very important conversation. It's a very important topic, and it's important to be clear that Zionism, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of racism are all the same thing. Those who fight Zionism, fight racism, fight anti-Semitism, they're on the other side.
What are your thoughts about this? Because, you know, what happens is two things that come to mind, right? Israel has some very odd bedfellows, right, when it comes to, especially within the U.S. establishment, such as very, very right-wingers, if I may call them that, who are in fact anti-Semitic. Well, they will then say things about Jews overall, Jewish population around the world, and we're not talking about Israel specifically in that regard, but they'll say and accuse them of certain things, and that's happened a number of times, even during Donald Trump's tenure. And then B, this then goes against what Israel says, because it says it's the only democracy in the region, but then as a democratic nation, then you would think that you should be open to, you know, criticism as a country. What are your thoughts on that?
I would not call the State of Israel a democracy by any stretch of the word, but I think it really goes down to this IHRA definition, which is a very vague document and extremely unclear, self-contradictory. One of the states that is vigorously supporting this definition is Hungary, which is currently ruled by a very anti-Semitic government. And the thing is, anti-Semitism is very real. I live in Germany, and there are attacks against synagogues, attacks against Jews just because they are Jews. According to police figures from the German police, more than 90% of those attacks come from the far right. And those far right activists and the parties that represent them, and it could also be the government of Hungary or the Trump administration that is thankfully over, are extremely also pro-Israel. There is no contradiction there. In many ways, it is part of their belief that by claiming to support the State of Israel, they could deflect accusations of anti-Semitism, but what they're actually proposing is to support the State of Israel as a place where Jews of all over the world, of all the world, should emigrate to. So this is pressure on Jews in Europe, in North America, and in other places to leave their homes and go to settle on Palestinian lands. This is, of course, like Miko just said, it is absolutely anti-Semitic to support that. And we should say there is now a new definition, because Jewish scholars have rejected the IHRA definition and came up with the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which is a different kind of definition based on comparing anti-Semitism with other forms of racism and clarifying that only victims of racism should have the right to define what counts as racism towards them. And of course, that criticism of the Israeli policies, of the Israeli government, of the Israeli state do not constitute as a form of anti-Semitism.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on this? Because as I put to our guests, this then really hurts discussions about what Israel is doing, and B, in fact, as alluded to just right now, it actually hurts, a real fight against true anti-Semitism as well.
Well, that's the point of it, of course, is that Israel is really very cynically separating itself in its struggle against the Palestinians for its own self-interest from the interests of the Jewish people overall. I mean, Jews overall have known that anti-racism and human rights are really the answer to anti-Semitism, like any other form of racism. René Cassin, who was the Jewish father, you might say, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, asked the Jews, do you really want to again become exceptions? In other words, the Fourth Geneva Convention that protects people living under occupation, like Palestinians, Israel says doesn't apply to us because we're an exception. We're an exception to everything, including human rights, because we have our own special history, our own special needs, and so on. And René Cassin, the Jewish legal scholar, says, do you really want to come outside of the umbrella again and be an exception again? Because that makes you very vulnerable. So the point is, I think, that if as Jews all over the world, we're concerned about anti-Semitism, which is a form of racism, which is fought by human rights and anti-racist work. But then we step outside and we say, but Israel's an exception. And it's not covered by human rights. And we can do whatever we want to do because we're Jews. That really puts Jews in jeopardy. And I think Israel, rather than being a refuge for Jews and so on, has really put the Jews of the world in jeopardy, because Netanyahu, who's on your screen, says in the UN, what I'm doing in Gaza, what the state of Israel is doing in the name of the Jewish people. This is a Jewish state. He's claimed as constituents millions of Jews all over the world that have never voted for him, that aren't Israeli, and that certainly don't share his policies. So it's a form of, the self-service of glomming on those Jews and making Israel supposedly represent them, has taken precedence over actually protecting Jews and fighting anti-Semitism.
Miko, I wanted to ask you about the American Jewish population and their point of view on what's just recently happened across the occupied territories. I mean, I have previously in my show discussed a possible shift in how things or how people around the world reacted to what just recently happened and what's now being and is still continuing to happen across the occupied territories. But do you think that the shift within the American Jews is now at a tipping point where they realize really what's happening on the ground? How significant is that change?
Well, we've been seeing a shift in public opinion, Jewish and non-Jewish, actually, in the United States over the years to a perspective that is more critical of Zionism and of the state of Israel. We see that the work of activists on campuses, Students for Justice in Palestine and other groups like it, who do tremendous work on campuses and have really been, I believe, the force that brought about the change that we see in public opinion and among Jews, because many of the students who participate in Palestine solidarity events are Jewish, to the point where today we have somebody who is a major contender for the presidency, a Jewish senator, along with other members of Congress, calling to withhold funding to Israel, the $735 million or whatever that was. And there is actually a bill. There's actually, people talking about this in the Senate and in Congress. That never would have happened if it wasn't for the work, I believe, of these students on campuses and the shift that we've been seeing, both in the Jewish community, but generally in public opinion in the United States. And we saw tens of thousands of people marching in cities that we've never seen. I'm talking about the United States, across the United States, in cities that we've never seen such numbers, supporting the Palestinian call for justice and to end this brutality, this violence, which, by the way, did not only take place in Gaza and in the territories occupied in 1967, but throughout all of occupied Palestine and what's called 1948 Palestine. There was enormous amounts of violence. I'm actually not in Jerusalem right now. I'm in Kalensawa, which is one of the cities of 1948 Palestine, where a great deal of violence has been perpetrated against Palestinians. And so I think this shift is definitely a positive thing, and hopefully it'll continue.
I wonder what your thoughts are about, from your vantage point there in Europe, about this shift that we've seen, right? I mean, it seemed that, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that via social media, of course, is my vantage point of observing this shift, is that there were higher and higher level people willing to now come out, both politicians and otherwise, come out and call out Israel. That is significant, is it not?
Yes, it is. I am personally stationed in Germany, so here the situation is very different from all other European states. In every European state now you hear more clear voices condemning war crimes that are perpetrated by the Israeli military, but unfortunately Germany is the exception. One of the reasons is that one of the things that people are crying out in demonstrations against this bombardment of Gaza that we've just seen for 2 weeks is that Israel kills children, and 58 children were killed by Israeli bombardments in this round, and it is something that is unfortunately a fact. Just mentioning the fact will make you be accused as an anti-Semite in the German media, because Germans say there is a kind of stereotype that Jews want to kill Christian children, and these are not Christian children in Gaza that were killed, or at least not most of them, but this stereotype shouldn't be used to silence people from saying the truth. And I think if we want to avoid those accusations, the only way to do that is that if the Israeli military will stop killing children. But the problem is that people's identity is being hijacked, especially in countries like Germany, but also I think in the United States and in Canada, where it is expected that if you're a Jew, then you have to support the state of Israel. And there was an article in the New York Times that called this new movement among U.S. Jews that are criticizing the state of Israel and even calling for boycott and calling for ending the aid and so on, an identity crisis of American Jews. And I think if this choice of word is very, very unfortunate. Do you think that Jews who condemn the murder of children have an identity crisis between the fact that they're Jews and that they oppose the murder of children? I don't think that Judaism stands for the murder of children in any way. And if you assume that, then this is really where the racism terrorism lies. And I think this is a very difficult conversation in Europe because the Holocaust has influenced European politics very much and still is very much alive in political debate as an argumenting tool. But eventually, I think the public opinion is going in the right direction, very slowly though.
What are your thoughts about this public opinion shift, global public opinion shift? I mean, does this, in fact, let me put it this way, have an effect on Israeli policies then on the ground? So I know you work around house demolitions a lot, but even house expulsions, right? So for example, Sheikh Jarrah, where one of the causes of this latest round of violence that we saw, and what happened in that neighborhood is continuing to happen, in fact, in that neighborhood. It's still an unresolved issue. Will this change, for example, Israeli policies towards those issues?
Well, it looks like it is changing them. I mean, now the Attorney General of Israel has ordered the courts to rethink what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. Khan al-Ahmer is a whole Bedouin community in the West Bank that was slated for demolition, that every right-wing party makes as a condition for joining the government to be demolished. That isn't being demolished because of world public opinion. So public opinion means a lot. And public opinion in the world is the Palestinians' only real ally. The problem is today that they support the Palestinians. You have BDS, you have other expressions of support. There's a big demonstration going on now in London, for example. But we're lacking a political program. They don't know, the international community doesn't know what to do, how to support Palestine. And what the Palestinians have to do now, in the wake of all of this is their opportunity to present a political program, to be proactive, a political end game, which means the only game can be one democratic state in the entire country. That's the only way out of this mess. And begin to mobilize those forces, because it's great that they exist, but they don't help you unless you mobilize them towards a common political end defined by Palestinians. And that end has to be decolonizing Zionism and establishing one democratic state of equal rights for everyone. If we can do that, then we can mobilize public opinion throughout the world, and they will begin to change government's policies, and then you're going to see some real change here.
You know, when it comes to the Biden administration and how it reacted to what happened just recently, it blocked calls for ceasefires at the United Nations a number of times, in fact. Biden's initial statements were only really about Israel. But then at the same time, he then did address the Palestinians in a sense where he, spoke about Rashida Tlaib, her grandmother, I believe it is, that he mentioned. Does that ever so slowly and ever so slightly possibly indicate that even for Biden, who has said in the past that he's very, very pro-Israel, that this may be because of public pressure?
It is only because of public pressure. Politicians never do the right thing unless they're forced to do so by their constituents. And so if it got to the point where Joe Biden said what he said and did what he did, it is only because of pressure by his constituents. There's no question about that. And that's why this pressure has to go on, has to be stronger, has to be more clear. Again, if we're talking about the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions for BDS, I think it lays out a very good roadmap. I think because the demands of the BDS call are very, very clear. They're calling for end of the military occupation, so that's part of Palestine that is still occupied militarily. It calls for the right of the Palestinian refugees to return, to be materialized, and then it talks about equal rights. So, I think this is actually lays out a very clear roadmap. And if the pressure continues, as I hope it will, because sometimes when the violence flares up, people tend to wake up, and then when the violence goes down, people go back to to being distracted by other things. But if the pressure continues, as I hope it does, then really what we want to see is elected officials realize that they must support a boycott, they must support sanctions, they must call for divestment from the State of Israel in order to remain in office. That's really where we want to be in places like in the United States and in Europe. We want to be at a place where You are shunned if you do not support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You are shunned if you identify yourself as a Zionist, just like you will be if you identified yourself as a racist and supremacist of any kind. That's really what I think we should be doing, and that's when we, hopefully things will change.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to leave there as a final comment, but we really appreciate Miko, Jeff, and Shir for taking their time out. A really important conversation, and I appreciate all three of their input into this discussion. We were discussing there, as I put to Miko at the beginning of the conversation, is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? And, that's a debate which has been raging for a while now, but it rages even more every time something happens in the occupied territories, and then there's an outpouring on social media discussing what's been happening. As our guests spoke of, it is unfair to equate Judaism and Jews around the world with Israel and what Israel does. And that's a very important distinction to make. So then criticizing Israel is not then equal to criticizing Jews and or Judaism. And a lot of Jews around the world realize that what Israel is doing is incorrect. And of course, many do still support Israel, and that's fine. And that's normal within any group of people, any ethnicity, any faith. Nevertheless, it's not a monolith. And so it's unfair to view it in that fashion as well. This is important because this, of course, then public pressure, public opinion then is affecting ever so slowly even policies. So as I mentioned right at the end there with Miko, when we've had now Biden addressing the only Palestinian within a position of power really around him, even though he has said in the past that he is very pro-Zionist, that is significant. That's a very small step possibly towards correcting and balancing really a proper U.S. policy then towards Palestine, Israel as well. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the Rohingya, specifically those who are in Cox's Bazar, as well as those who are dependent, a lot of them at least, who have had to flee Myanmar, dependent on international aid. And we're going to hone in on a story coming out of the UK, where the UK government has decided to cut aid for the Rohingya by 40%, which is quite a significant number. Now, on the part of the UK government, their argument seemingly is that this is being done because of the pandemic and the economic impact of the pandemic, which I will put, of course, to our panelists who are joining us as to whether or not that is a legitimate argument to make. But what does this then mean for the Rohingya themselves and the UK's stance towards them? Does this mean that they are coming down then on the priority list? And who will then, and who in the international community overall then will stand up for these people and help them at this time? A 40% cut is quite significant and will probably affect the Rohingya in very significant manners, which they will not be able to overcome quite easily unless somebody else, of course, steps up to fill in that vacuum. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Khin, who is the president of the Burmese Rohingya Organization UK. He's joining us today from London. Joining us from Birmingham is Rowe, who is a political commentator. And joining us from Cardiff is Dr. Palash Kamruzzaman, who is a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of South Wales. Palash, Keith, and Khin, thank you to all three of you for joining us today. Khin, I'd like to start with you. Your organization has responded to this decision of the UK to cut this aid, but as you know, on the UK government's part, they're saying this is happening seemingly in part because of the pandemic. What do you make of that argument?
I think that is very discouraging. UK government played a key role in the past, and UK is a penholder in UN Security Council, political side the other way, and these genocide survivors, it's been like about now 4 years almost. The aid is the most important for them, and especially we are even pushing, rebuilding the community. We have to look that Rohingya people, they've been many decades facing persecution, and until now, even in Burma, situation getting worse after the coup in February 1. UK government, the way how they cut it, it is totally, irresponsible, the way how UK government cut it off. And we are very worried, for the future of Rohingya genocide survivors, we can see that in very near future, Rohingya cannot return. And one thing is, whenever international meetings and coming up that they are supporting aid and others, they used to talk, but practically now we can see this is really danger for our community. We really need, international community have to look at quite wider way for the long run. That is very that is very discouraging for the Rohingya. So as a Burmese Rohingya organization, UK, we are based in London, we want to push our best to push UK again and also European Union and others. And we can see very near future Rohingya cannot return. The genocide is still ongoing in Burma. So we want to focus more also, other countries. We have to do a lot of work, and the international community, international NGOs have to do much more work that, I worry that other countries may take example of UK. So it is very, very worrying for Rohingya community what UK have done. So we really need to do a lot of work. That's what I can see. Thank you.
Yeah. Keith, I wanted to get your thoughts on this because while I, can sort of understand the argument on the UK government's part that this is happening because of the pandemic, a 40% cut is very significant. I mean, in the sense of even keeping that argument in mind, it seems like it's a bit of a stretch for us to run with this. What are your thoughts on that?
First thing I would say is that everybody has to feel for the plight of these people who have been persecuted, driven out of their homes, and they are, of course, in a terrible situation. It's not entirely the United Kingdom's government's job to put it right. In fact, the main way that this is ever going to be solved, rather than just throwing money at it or putting money into the situation, the only way this issue is going to be solved is through some sort of political solution whereby these people can have homes of their own and start to rebuild their lives. So the first thing I would say is this is not just a case of anybody across the world putting more money into helping them. Of course, that's important in the short term, but you mustn't become reliant on that. And of course, since 2017, the United Kingdom has given £321 million to the Rohingya response, which is a considerable sum of money. It's pledged, I think, another 27.6 million or something for the current year. So again, the United Kingdom is stepping up to the plate, and it's one of the most generous countries across the world in terms of giving aid to various causes. It's not, of course, the only call on the United Kingdom's budget, foreign aid budget, is not the Rohingyas. There are other deserving cases across the world. And in all of them, pretty much the United Kingdom government is one of the most generous, and the people of the United Kingdom are also incredibly generous when they're asked to donate their own money as well. But the guiding thing has to be that if you're ever going to just stop being reliant on aid, at some point there has to be a political solution. And that's really where the main efforts should come. And I hope that the United Kingdom government is playing its part in that.
Let's talk about then dependence on aid, because that's an argument that's been made many, many times, not just, of course, in the case of Rohingya, but in many such cases where people do receive international aid, different kinds of people around the world, as Keith alluded to as well. And at the same time, then there's the issue of the root cause of all, the fact that these people have had to flee their own country and have had to seek refuge then in Bangladesh as well, which also then needs help to be able to host these people. So it's complex within this, the fact that we are going through economic issues around the world because of the pandemic as well. What's a reasonable resolution to this then?
Thank you. I think it's a very valid question, but the question has no short answer. You have highlighted that this year the aid has been cut 42%. To be more specific, and it is coming down from 47.5 million to 27.6 million pound, which is right. But if you look a little further, even previous year in 2019, the aid budget for Rohingyas from UK government was, I say, 117 million pound. So there is a decline in any way. It is not just new from pandemic, and this is the outcome. I absolutely agree that this is not an humanitarian crisis entirely. It is a political crisis that was originated in Burma, that was caused by an oppressive government as a whole. And it is important that, yes, to some extent not to be reliant on aid, but what other options do we have at this minute? These people, in great numbers, some 900,000 people, nearly 1 million people, and now if you include the host community around them, they need to survive. First of all, political resolution will come, the dignified return will come once there will be safe and conducive environment to return for these vulnerable people. So there is a consensus that these people are vulnerable, these people are most persecuted, and I tend to echo with Mr. Tun Khin when he says yes, international community is doing all these things, but it seems majorly, very widely lip service. They're doing all the talks, but it is important. We need to have a serious political effort, serious diplomatic effort to make a political resolution. Hey, this is the 4th year. That is not happening. Do we see any concrete evidence of diplomacy and all these things and serious pressure on Myanmar government? No. Then it comes to the point how these people need to survive. And that's why we need to maintain the aid flow that gives the bare minimum. Nobody's problem. I have been in the camps. If you go to the camps, these people are not living on luxury. Yeah. Then you talk about you're getting reliant on aid. These people are having miserable lives. Absolutely miserable, absolutely congested and inhuman. I have seen it by my eyes. I have not been to the Vasancho, cannot talk about that, but that is the case. So to keep these people alive in a manner that they're having minimal life in a more or less dignified way, aid is also important. Let's not forget about that when you talk about the rhetorics, and I emphasize that rhetoric of political crisis, but the reality is we talk about that, but we are not seeing any concrete action on that front.
Tun Khin, on the point of the fact that we do need a political resolution at some point, right? We need pressure on the Myanmar government. How do you assess the UK in that regard? I know that for a while in the past, the UK has supported Aung San Suu Kyi, especially when she was under house arrest. Speaking about the previous time that she was under house arrest, not this time around. And when she then came into power, there was still some form of support of her until then the Rohingya crisis begun or restarted, as we may call it. What do you make of the UK role overall in that situation?
UK, that is very disappointing that firstly, when we talk about political thing, they try to divert that, we are second largest donor for the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar, but we can see that been decreased. That is first thing disappointing. Secondly, we one thing, whenever I've been visited many times to the camps, one thing we heard from the genocide survivors is they unitedly, one voice we heard from them is we want justice. So we have justice cases in ICJ, ICC, and we are pushing to support International Court of Justice case from, Canada join, Netherlands join. We want to see UK should join there. Still, UK is reluctant, and many MPs push for it, and UK is still not joining to support the case. That is another disappointment. And also, Aung San Suu Kyi, Shir, who is, she defended the case in ICJ, and UK before they were quite a strong supporter, but still we are not very sure. But she's under house arrest now. So one thing we are still pushing that UK have to make clear: are they supporting international? Why they are not supporting International Court of Justice the case? So I can see totally, they are raising the issue in even Security Council. UK is a pen holder. UK should do more. I'm not. I appreciate what they're trying to do, but I can see that it's very disappointing that they are not doing enough at all. Yeah. And the other thing is Burma colonial period time. UK, British conquered Arakan. British know that Rohingya existence, Rohingya identity, Rohingya long time living in Arakan state. They have all documents, yeah. But UK is still not stronger enough to push for the rights for the Rohingya. That is very important compared with other countries. I want to point out because, as I grew up in Arkansas State, British colonial period time, they built the roads and tunnels and still there. So after UK left, independence, we got our rights being, totally. A few years we got our rights, and after military coup power, our rights been taken away. So UK should play a key role on Rohingya issue particularly, and as a security member, Security Council pen holder, they have a lot of opportunities to do, and for the justice and accountability.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that?
Khin, I'm going to come in just because we're quickly running out of time. I apologize for interrupting you. I wanted to give Keith and Palash time for final comments before I let all three of you go. Keith, I completely take your point, and I think the other guests have understood your point about the fact that, of course, yes, the UK is not fully responsible for the situation, A, and B, that aid is not the solution. That is, in fact, a political issue. But then going back to the UK role, as Khin there was mentioning, as Palash was mentioning as well, what should the UK role then be, in your opinion, going forward? A, regarding the coup that's taken place, but B, even on this Rohingya issue, which remains seemingly the longer-lasting, outstanding issue of human rights, etc., in that country.
The UK still has a role to play. It's still giving very large sums of money. What a disappointment I think the whole world must feel in Aung San Suu Kyi, who was backed by the British government and supported certainly morally during her initial house arrest. And hasn't she let everybody down, allowing this to take place? And then, of course, there was the military coup. And I know that the United Kingdom government is placing huge pressure, as much as they can, on a foreign government to try and stop the atrocities taking place, and to allow the Rohingya people to rebuild their lives. It's also giving large sums of money. It's also doing something that maybe some of the other commentators don't 100% appreciate, in that the British economy during the COVID crisis, the British economy was doing very well beforehand, and it's still relatively strong now, but it's been ravaged over the COVID crisis, and huge amounts of debt have been built up. And what this means is that every English pound that is given to any aid cause across the world is in effect being borrowed. The British government is borrowing money in order to give it abroad. Now, that's fine. We have to play our part internationally, and I don't think anybody objects to that. But there is huge pressure to say, particularly in this year when the economy is under such great strain, to say we have to cut things down, we have to not be quite as generous, although we're still being pretty generous.
And I take your point on that, Keith. Go ahead if you can, just very, very quickly if you can. Go ahead.
My point I would just made is that I know that across these camps, as across the rest of the world, the COVID crisis has absolutely run rampant, and the people in the camps have suffered. Yeah. Now, it is the British government, among a couple of others only, who have put the huge effort and massive financial support into developing vaccines that are the only way that the whole world is going to get away from this virus. Right. It is the British government that's helped to develop these, and it's the British government that is giving the vaccines through the international aid programs. On top of this money, this is additional to this money to help save lives in the Rohingya camps. So I think we just have to put a bit of balance.
Indeed, indeed. And I appreciate where you're there, Keith. Palash, a final word to you on what Keith there has said about what the UK role should be, and what Khin earlier said as well.
Points. Of course, UK aid plays an important role. UK is one of the leading donors, and it needs to be recognized, but it doesn't mean that they cannot do more. The idea is that UK is also working with Bangladesh government. And if you look at the joint response plan, very recently, Bangladesh government has produced, in association with other humanitarian communities and even agencies, they have identified that they will need $930 million US. And the donors have only pledged only $340 million US. It's just the 35%. Simple question, where the money will come from? If there is a deficit, this will definitely going to affect these people's lives. And we are talking about lives not numbers, right? Of course, like in the UK, will have to look after its economy. Nobody's denying that. But the key issue is what is happening. The UK aid budget has gone from 15.8 billion to 13.3 billion this year due to aid cut due to pandemic, right? So this is not a great deal of money the government is saving, but the victim in the long run is British government and British people and the humanity. Because what the nearly £3 billion the government is saving, the UK is losing its grip in terms of humanitarian leadership, global leadership, not doing the right things for the people they were under its colony. And the case is more broadly, because nothing is isolated. If you look at the mismanagement, mishandling of the COVID-related corruption and budget in terms of dealing the pandemics, those are way bigger than this small amount of money, right? That is to be considered. If we need to be as UK taxpayer, I myself, if I want to understand that I need to see the value for money every penny I pay in terms of tax, I am also responsible and perfectly it is legitimate to ask, what about accountability of those corruptions and the mismanagements of the COVID pandemic in giving various corrupted deals for their for political friends and nepotism.
And we'll have to leave it there at that, Peled. I do just sincerely apologize for interrupting you, but you made a very good point there at the end as well. Certainly there is a lot to discuss when it comes to corruption in many places around the world when it comes to the pandemic, but even in this regard. We appreciate Palash, Keith and Khin for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules this Saturday to share their expertise with us when it comes to the UK decision to cut aid to the Rohingya, especially in Cox's Bazar, and of course in other places around the world who have had to flee Myanmar, their own country, seeking safety from persecution that they were under in their own country. 40% is a very significant number to cut aid by, and how then are these people expected to then move on? What are they expected to do? Who will make up for this deficit then that they're going to be going under? It's not like they were living in luxury, as Palash there said. At the same time, as Keith tried to contextualize for us, the UK government is also, as with any other government around the world, going through a bit of an economic crisis because of the pandemic. So there were cuts to be expected, but was this the right place to make the cuts? And what of then the political role that the UK can play in hopefully resolving the Rohingya issue once and for all? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.